At a party, I saw a woman wearing my wedding ring. Not one like it. Mine. Custom designed. One of a kind. And when she smiled and said, "My fiancé made it for me last month," my body went cold before my mind could catch up. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I didn't even step back. I asked one quiet question that split my life cleanly in two. "What's his name?" She didn't answer out loud. She reached into her phone, still smiling, still warm, still unaware she was standing on the fault line of my marriage. She showed me a photo, just a casual swipe. A man standing in sunlight, one arm raised, laughing at whoever was behind the camera. It was my husband. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this must be what shock actually feels like. Not chaos, not panic, but an eerie calm, like someone had pressed mute on the world while my heart kept pounding alone in a sealed room. My name is Emily Parker. At the time, I was 30 years old, married for 3.5 years, and absolutely certain I knew the man I slept beside every night. I believed in routines. I believed in loyalty. I believed that the life I had built, brick by careful brick, was real. That belief died in a stranger's living room, beneath warm lights and cheap champagne, while music hummed low enough to be polite. The party itself was nothing special. A friend of a friend situation. One of those adult gatherings where everyone pretends they are not scanning the room for exits after an hour. I almost didn't go. I remember standing in my bedroom, adjusting my dress, thinking it would be easier to stay home and fold laundry while rewatching something familiar. If I had stayed home, I would have learned the truth eventually. I know that now. But learning it that way, face to face, ring to ring, smile to smile, changed the shape of it forever. When I first noticed the ring, it wasn't dramatic. It was instinct. That quiet tug of recognition you feel before logic intervenes. My eyes caught the stone across the room, and something in my chest tightened. Same cut, same unusual setting, same faint asymmetry on the band that I'd once teased my husband about. He had laughed and said imperfections were proof of human hands. I drifted closer without realizing I was moving. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Custom rings aren't that unique. Designers reuse ideas. Coincidences happen. But the closer I got, the louder my pulse became. When she lifted her hand to gesture while talking, I saw the tiny engraving on the inside of the band. I didn't need to read it. I knew where it was. I knew what it said. I had traced those letters with my thumb on nights when sleep wouldn't come. My mouth opened before my brain could form a plan. I complimented the ring. My voice sounded normal. That still scares me. She beamed. She told me it was custom. One of a kind. Made by her fiancé just last month. Last month, my husband had told me he was working late. Last month, he had come home smelling like city air and excuses. Last month, I had believed him. I asked her his name, and then she showed me the photo. Everything I thought I understood about my life collapsed inward, silently, like a building engineered to fall straight down. I stood there, holding a plastic cup I didn't remember picking up, staring at the face I kissed goodbye every morning. The face I defended. The face I trusted. And in that moment, with strangers laughing around us and music drifting through the room, I realized I had a choice to make, one that would define everything that came after. Do you confront the truth the second it reveals itself? Or do you step back into the dark long enough to decide how much light you can survive? Before that night, my life was quiet in a way I used to be proud of. Not boring, steady, predictable. The kind of life people say they want when they are tired of chaos. I lived in a modest townhouse on the edge of the city with my husband, Daniel. 2 bedrooms, neutral walls, a narrow staircase that creaked on the 3rd step no matter how many times we promised to fix it. We had matching mugs without meaning to. A shared calendar on the fridge. A system. We woke up at the same time every weekday. I made coffee. He toasted bread. Some mornings we talked. Some mornings we didn't. Silence wasn't a threat in our house. It was just space. I thought that meant we were solid. Daniel was attentive in quiet ways. He remembered how I took my tea. He warmed my car on cold mornings if he left after me. When I had a bad day, he didn't try to fix it. He listened. Or at least, he stayed still long enough that I believed he was listening. We didn't fight often. That was something I used to say with confidence, like it was evidence of success. When disagreements came up, they were logistical. Money, scheduling, whose turn it was to call the plumber. We never raised our voices. We never slammed doors. We never said cruel things we'd have to apologize for later. I mistook calm for honesty. On weekends, we grocery shopped together. He pushed the cart. I read labels. We planned meals we didn't always cook. Sometimes we laughed in the aisles, quietly, like we were trying not to disturb anyone else's life. Sometimes we didn't. Again, space. If you had asked me then whether I trusted my husband, I wouldn't have hesitated. Trust wasn't something I actively thought about. It was just there, like gravity, present enough to forget. I had friends who worried loudly about infidelity. They checked phones. They tracked locations. They joked about it, but the jokes had edges. I never joined in. Not because I thought I was better, because I didn't feel the need. Daniel never guarded his phone. He never panicked when I walked into a room. If he worked late, he told me in advance. If plans changed, he explained. Nothing about his behavior screamed liar. That's the part people struggle with when I tell this story later. They want red flags. They want signs I ignored. They want proof that betrayal announces itself if you're smart enough to listen. Sometimes it doesn't. The ring had been his idea. He wanted to design it himself. He said he wanted something that didn't look like it came out of a glass case under fluorescent lights. He talked about symbolism, about meaning. He even sketched ideas on napkins. I remember thinking it was romantic, personal, proof of effort. When he gave it to me, I cried, not because it was extravagant, but because it felt intentional. Like he had carved out a space in the world that only belonged to us. That belief became part of how I saw him. Looking back, there were moments that now feel slightly off. Not alarming, just small inconsistencies I smoothed over without realizing I was doing it. A late meeting that ran longer than expected. A weekend errand that didn't quite add up. A distracted look that I blamed on stress. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would justify suspicion. I had no reason to doubt him. And that's what made the doubt so destabilizing later. It had nowhere to land. No history to cling to. No pattern to point at and say, there. That's where it started. The night of the party, I told him where I was going. He kissed my cheek and told me to have fun. He said he'd probably turn in early. Big week ahead. I believed him. As I drove to that house, I remember thinking how lucky I was to have a relationship that felt uncomplicated. How rare it was to feel settled before 35. How nice it was not to be waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's strange, realizing how confident you were, only after the ground gives way. Sometimes, when I replay that version of myself in my mind, I don't feel embarrassed. I feel tender toward her. She was living honestly, based on the information she had. She wasn't foolish. She was trusting. And trust, I've learned, is not a flaw. It's just dangerous in the wrong hands. That night didn't create the lie. It just brought it into the light. I didn't confront her right away. That surprises people when I say it out loud. But in that moment, my instincts didn't tell me to explode. They told me to observe, to slow everything down, to gather air before I tried to breathe again. After she showed me the photo, after my husband's face filled her phone, I felt my body go strangely precise. My hands steadied. My shoulders relaxed. It was like some internal switch flipped from emotion to assessment. I smiled. I even laughed softly, as if I were reacting to something charming. "Oh," I said, "he looks familiar." That was a lie, but it bought me time. She launched into a story about how they met. A work event. A mutual friend. She talked about his creativity, his thoughtfulness, how he surprised her with the ring after only a few months. She said he was different from anyone she'd dated before. More grounded. More intentional. Each word landed like a small weight, stacking carefully on my chest. I asked gentle questions. The kind people ask when they are interested, not threatened. How long had they been together? Where did he work? Did they live close by? Her answers were casual, consistent. She had no reason to lie. They'd been together 6 months. He lived a little outside the city. He worked in consulting, traveled sometimes, busy schedule. Every detail overlapped with my life just enough to be unmistakable, but not enough to feel surreal. This wasn't a fantasy version of my husband. This was him. The same man, the same patterns, just rerouted. I remember noticing how happy she looked. Not performative happy, not the kind people project online. Real, unguarded excitement. The kind that comes from believing you're building something solid. That hurt more than I expected. There's a specific kind of nausea that comes from realizing someone else has been living inside your life without your consent. That they've been touching the same stories, hearing the same reassurances, being handed the same carefully curated version of a person you thought was yours alone. At some point, she excused herself to get another drink. I stood there alone, staring at the condensation sliding down my cup. The room felt louder, brighter, slightly tilted. I checked my phone without thinking. No new messages, no missed calls, just the quiet confirmation of a man who had no idea his timelines were colliding. That's when doubt crept in, not about what I had seen, but about me. I wondered if I was misunderstanding something, if there was an explanation I hadn't considered. A cousin who looked identical, a client, a coincidence too elaborate to be coincidence. I wanted that to be true, but my body didn't believe it. My body had already catalogued too many matching details. The way he smiled in the photo, the jacket I'd bought him last winter, the scar near his eyebrow he'd gotten in college. You don't mistake those things. Still, I didn't leave. I stayed at the party. I moved through conversations like someone underwater, smiling at the wrong moments, nodding too slowly. I listened more than I spoke, and I watched her. She wasn't hiding anything. She wasn't secretive or defensive. She spoke openly about their plans, moving in together, maybe a small wedding, something simple. She said she liked how private he was. How steady. Private. Steady. Those words echoed in my head. At one point, someone asked how long Daniel and I had been married. I answered automatically. 3.5 years. My voice didn't shake. No one in that room knew they were standing inside the early moments of my unraveling. No one noticed that every laugh scraped against something raw. There's a strange loneliness in that, carrying a truth so heavy it bends you inward, while the world keeps moving at a polite, indifferent pace. I thought about leaving a dozen times, about confronting her, about calling him right there, forcing everything into the open. But something held me back. Not fear, not denial, control. If I acted on impulse, I'd lose the ability to choose how this story unfolded next. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I stayed. I listened. I memorized details. And by the time I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, one thing was clear. Whatever was happening in my marriage wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a structure, carefully built, carefully maintained. And I was standing at the edge of it, deciding how and when to pull the first piece loose. There's a moment like that in most lives, I think, when you realize the truth isn't going anywhere, and the only question left is how long you'll make it wait. I walked to my car with that question pressing gently, insistently, against my ribs. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting in my lap, staring at nothing. The street light flickered above me, casting that uneven orange glow that makes everything feel slightly unreal. My chest felt tight, but not in a way that demanded release. It was more like containment, like my body was holding everything in until I decided what to do with it. I replayed the night in fragments. The ring, the smile, the photo. Each detail returned sharper than the last, as if my mind were testing them for weakness, looking for cracks, finding none. When I finally drove, I took the long way home. I needed the extra minutes. I needed the illusion that time was still something I could stretch. Daniel's car was in the driveway when I pulled in. That small, ordinary sight hit harder than anything at the party. Proof that both versions of his life were still running smoothly. No overlap. No visible damage. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. He had gone to bed early, just like he said he would. His shoes were by the door. His jacket hung where it always did. Everything was exactly where it should have been. I stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the clock. Normal sounds. A normal life. In the bathroom, I washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My face looked the same, but something behind my eyes had shifted, like a lens knocked slightly out of alignment. I took off my ring. That was the first time I'd removed it since our wedding day. I turned it slowly between my fingers, feeling the familiar weight. The band caught the light, and there it was, the engraving. The one no one else was supposed to have. The one I'd seen earlier that night on another woman's hand. There are moments when pain doesn't announce itself with tears. It arrives quietly, with clarity. This was one of those moments. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and held the ring in my palm, and the truth finally settled into place. Not just that Daniel was cheating, but that he had replicated something sacred. That he had taken the care, the symbolism, the story, and duplicated it for someone else without hesitation. That level of betrayal isn't impulsive. It's deliberate. I thought about all the times he'd told me he was working late. All the weekends he'd run errands alone. The trips he said were mandatory. The gaps I'd never questioned because I trusted the man filling them. Trust has a way of rearranging memory. It edits out suspicion. It softens edges. And when it breaks, it gives everything back at once. I lay in bed next to him that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. He slept easily, peacefully, one arm flung over the space where I usually curled into him. I didn't move. I wondered how many nights he'd done this. How many times he'd come home from her place and slipped into our bed like nothing had happened. How often he'd looked at my face while carrying her secrets behind his eyes. If you've ever had a realization like that, one that reframes your entire history in a single instant, you know how isolating it feels. It's not just heartbreak. It's disorientation. Like discovering the language you've been speaking fluently your whole life has been mistranslated. I didn't cry until morning. It happened quietly, in the shower, with the water running hot enough to fog the mirror. No sobbing, just tears mixing with steam, my hand pressed flat against the tile to keep myself upright. That was my lowest point. Not the shock, not the anger, but the grief of understanding that the marriage I believed in had never existed the way I thought it did. I wasn't just losing him. I was losing the version of myself who felt safe. By the time I turned off the water, something else had joined the pain. A stillness, a sense of resolve that surprised me with its calm. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to beg for the truth. I was going to take it. The morning after discovery didn't feel dramatic. It felt surgical. I woke up before Daniel, moved through the house silently, and made coffee I barely tasted. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I watched him instead. How he stretched, how he yawned, how he kissed my forehead like muscle memory. There was no guilt on his face, no hesitation. That told me everything I needed to know. I realized then that if I reacted emotionally, I'd be stepping into a version of this story he was prepared for. Apologies, excuses, gaslighting disguised as concern. I'd cry, he'd swear it meant nothing, and suddenly I'd be the one begging for clarity while he controlled the pace. I wasn't willing to do that. So I decided to slow down. I took a day off work, told him I wasn't feeling well. That wasn't a lie. I just didn't specify what kind of illness I was carrying. While he left for the office, his real office, I assumed, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. What do I need to know before I act? That question grounded me. I started with facts, not feelings. Facts are harder to twist. I checked bank statements. Nothing flashy. But there were small charges that didn't belong to us. Dinners for two I hadn't attended. A boutique hotel an hour away. Rideshare receipts at strange times. I opened our shared laptop. I didn't snoop wildly. I followed patterns. Calendar entries that said client meeting. trips that overlapped suspiciously with dates the woman at the party had mentioned. Everything lined up with quiet precision. What struck me most wasn't the scale of the deception, but the effort. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a second life, carefully budgeted and emotionally compartmentalized. At some point, I stopped feeling shocked and started feeling insulted. Not just betrayed, but underestimated. I thought about confronting him immediately, about demanding explanations, watching his face scramble for something convincing. But that would give him the chance to rewrite the narrative before I understood the full scope. I wanted control. Not revenge. Control. So I waited. Over the next 2 weeks, I became observant in a way I'd never been before. I noted patterns. I memoized lies. I noticed how he repeated certain phrases when he wasn't being truthful. How his voice lifted slightly at the end of sentences meant to reassure. I smiled when appropriate. I responded when spoken to. I kept the peace. Inside, something was shifting. There's a moment in deep betrayal where the pain stops being the loudest thing in the room, where it steps aside and makes space for clarity. That's where I was now. I reached out to a lawyer, not dramatically, not with a plan already formed. Just a conversation. Just information. I asked practical questions. I learned where I stood. Knowledge steadied me. One night, as Daniel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the other woman. Not with anger, at least, not toward her. She hadn't taken anything from me. She'd been handed a lie, wrapped in craftsmanship and charm. I wondered what she would do if she knew. If she would confront him. If she would walk away. If she would blame herself. That thought stayed with me. There's a strange moral gray space in moments like this, when you have the power to expose the truth, but doing so will detonate multiple lives, including your own. I wrestled with that responsibility quietly. Was it my job to protect her? Was it my right to stay silent? Was truth always the ethical choice, even when it guarantees damage? I don't have a universal answer. I only know what felt right for me. By the end of those 2 weeks, my decision was made, not in anger, not in desperation, but in full awareness of the consequences. I wasn't going to confront him privately. I wasn't going to scream or cry or ask why. I was going to make sure the truth arrived intact, impossible to deny, and witnessed by the one person he had worked hardest to deceive. Some people call that revenge. I call it refusing to carry someone else's lie any longer. And once that decision settled in my bones, the fear I'd been carrying finally loosened its grip. I slept deeply for the first time since the party. The calm before action isn't loud. It's precise. I chose a Sunday, not because it was symbolic, but because it was convenient. Daniel told me he had a team retreat that weekend. 2 nights, out of town. He packed light, kissed me goodbye, promised to call. Instead, I drove to the address I already knew by heart. I didn't rush. I didn't rehearse speeches. I wore jeans, a simple sweater, my hair down. I wasn't going there as a wife begging for answers. I was going there as a witness delivering truth. Her apartment building was modern. Clean lines. Secure entry. I waited in my car for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing evenly. I checked my phone once. No messages from him. Good. I rang the buzzer. She answered the door barefoot, smiling politely, clearly expecting someone else. The smile faded, slowly, as she took me in, my calm, my stillness, the way I already seemed to know where I was. I think we need to talk, I said. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Let me in. Daniel was there, sitting on her couch, comfortable, familiar, a mug in his hand, the one from our house, the one with the chipped rim. The moment stretched. He stood up so fast the mug tipped, spilling coffee onto the rug. His face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed again, like he couldn't decide which lie to reach for first. Emily, he started. I held up my hand. Not yet. My voice didn't shake. That surprised him. It surprised me too. I turned to her. My name is Emily Parker, I said. I'm married to Daniel. We've been together 7 years. Married for 3.5. Silence slammed into the room. Her eyes moved between us, confusion sharpening into something colder. She looked at him, waiting. He didn't speak. I continued. The ring you're wearing, he designed it for me first. That engraving? It's the same. I saw it at the party 2 weeks ago. She looked down at her hand like it had burned her. No, she whispered. That's not Daniel. He finally spoke. Fast. Clumsy. It's not what it looks like. I was going to tell you. Things are complicated. Complicated. I let out a breath. Almost a laugh. There it is, I said softly. That word again. She stood up now, backing away from him like she needed distance to think. Her voice was tight, controlled. Tell me the truth. Right now. He looked at me, then at her, calculating. I could see it, the instinct to minimize, to reshape. He opened his mouth. I interrupted. I have bank statements, I said. Dates, hotels, messages, and I've already spoken to a lawyer. That did it. Something collapsed in his posture. His shoulders dropped. His face hardened, not with remorse, but with exposure. She stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time. You told me you were divorced, she said. You told me she moved away. He didn't answer. That was louder than any confession. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't need to. The truth had landed. Clean. Undeniable. As I walked to the door, she spoke behind me. Her voice broke on my name. I'm so sorry. I turned back once. Looked at her. Really looked. I know, I said. And I meant it. Outside, the air felt lighter. Sharper. Like the world had been recalibrated. I sat in my car and waited until my hands stopped shaking, not from fear, but from release. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt finished. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be placed where they can't be ignored. If you had been there, watching that moment unfold, what do you think would have stayed with you longer? His silence, or the exact second the lies stopped working? The aftermath didn't explode the way people imagine it does. It receded, quietly, gradually, like water pulling back after a storm, leaving debris in places you don't notice until you trip over it. Daniel didn't come home that night, or the next. He sent a message, long, rambling, heavy with apologies that arrived too late to matter. He said he wanted to explain. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he was confused. I didn't respond. When he finally did come back to the house, it was during the day, while I was at work. He packed a bag, took some clothes, left others behind. The closet looked uneven afterward, like a smile missing teeth. We spoke once, briefly, in the kitchen. No raised voices, no dramatics. He cried. I didn't. Not because I was stronger, but because I had already done my grieving alone. I told him I was filing for divorce. I told him communication could go through our lawyers. I told him I needed space. He nodded like someone who had run out of arguments. In the weeks that followed, my life narrowed. Not in a sad way, in a clarifying one. I focused on work, on sleep, on simple meals. I stopped pretending I was fine for people who hadn't earned that performance. Some friends were incredible. They showed up with groceries, sat with me in silence, let me talk without trying to fix anything. Others faded. They didn't know what to say. Or maybe they didn't want to choose sides. I let them go without resentment. Loss has a way of simplifying your priorities. The house felt different without him. Quieter, but not lonely. I rearranged furniture, donated things we'd bought together, took down photos that no longer matched the truth of my life. One night, I found the ring box in the back of a drawer. Empty. I hadn't worn the ring since the night of the party. I held the box for a long time, then placed it back and closed the drawer gently. Some chapters don't need a dramatic ending. They just need to stop. The divorce was clean. Painful, yes, but not chaotic. There were moments of anger, moments of sadness that arrived unexpectedly, like waves I hadn't scheduled. But there was also relief. Relief that I no longer had to question my reality. Relief that the truth was no longer something I carried alone. Relief that my life, though altered, was finally honest. I heard through mutual acquaintances that the engagement ended quickly, that she moved out, that Daniel struggled with the fallout more than he expected. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, just distance. Healing isn't about watching someone else suffer. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away without realizing it. Slowly, I started trusting my instincts again. Not blindly, but respectfully. I learned the difference between peace and avoidance, between calm and silence. There's a version of me who existed before that party, soft, certain, unguarded. I didn't lose her completely. I integrated her. If you've ever walked away from a life you thought was permanent, you know this part isn't glamorous. It's quiet, repetitive, made of small decisions that don't feel heroic in the moment. But one day, you realize you're breathing fully again. And that matters more than any dramatic ending ever could. It's been a while since all of this happened. Long enough that the memories no longer ambush me. Long enough that the sound of my own voice telling this story feels steady instead of sharp. Time didn't erase what happened, but it changed how it lives inside me. For a long time, I thought the hardest part was losing my marriage, that the pain came from watching a future dissolve. But that wasn't it. The hardest part was realizing how confidently I had handed someone access to my reality, and how quietly they had edited it without my consent. Betrayal doesn't just break trust in another person. It forces you to renegotiate trust with yourself. I had to relearn how to listen to that small, steady voice inside me. The one that notices details before they become proof. The one that feels something shift before words exist for it. I didn't silence that voice before, but I didn't prioritize it either. Now, I do. I don't regret loving deeply. I don't regret believing in the life I was building. Those weren't mistakes. They were expressions of who I was at the time. Open, hopeful, sincere. What I regret is how long I believed strength meant endurance. Sometimes, strength is clarity. Sometimes, it's restraint. And sometimes, it's walking away without needing the other person to understand why. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: truth has weight. And when you stop carrying someone else's lies, you suddenly have room to stand upright again. I don't tell this story to warn you against love, or to suggest suspicion is wisdom. I tell it because life has a way of testing what we think we know about others and about ourselves. And when that test comes, you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be cruel to be decisive. You don't have to destroy everything to protect what still matters. Before I end, I want to leave you with one quiet question. No answer required. Not now, maybe not ever. When something in your life feels solid, how do you know it's built on truth and not just familiarity? So that's my story. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far my voice travels. The moral is simple. Clarity may arrive through pain, but once it does, it gives you back your life.